If Michael played today,
Yeah.
he'd probably average almost 50 a game.
How many points a game would Michael Jordan average if he played in this league, this style, the way they play now?
10 more than his highest year.
47.
MJ would get 50.
Phil Jackson said this when he was promoting his book years ago. If Mike played today, he would average 45 in his prime.
Easy.
You believe that?
Mm-hmm.
If Michael played in this era, he'll average 50.
Many old heads who witness Jordan play always make these claims. They say if Jordan played today, he would tear up today's league, average 50, and so on. But why do they say these things? Is it because they're all fans of Jordan? Or is it because they hate today's young players? Those are ways some people choose to spin it. But if you ask me, it's simply their honest thoughts based on what they saw from Jordan when they played, and based on the ways the game has changed and how offense is more inflated in modern basketball. That is essentially what inspired this video. But let's take a more analytical approach and figure out how much we think Jordan would average if he played in the modern NBA. First off, before we continue, let's establish two things. One, Michael Jordan is the greatest scorer ever, and two, offense is easier nowadays. Establishing Jordan as the greatest scorer shouldn't be a difficult starting point. Jordan has the highest points per game average in NBA history at 30.1, just slightly ahead of Wilt Chamberlain. Jordan also has the highest playoff scoring average of all time at 33.4 points. No one else averages over 30. MJ has the most scoring titles ever at 10, Wilt is second at 7, and no one other than Wilt has half as many as Jordan does. He also did all of his scoring in an era where less points were available, which brings us to the next point. Points are easier to score today. In MJ's final season with the Bulls, he averaged 28.7 points per game as a 35-year-old, and teams around the league were averaging a total of 95.6 points per game. In today's NBA, teams are averaging 111.4 points per game. To put that in perspective, that's the highest average since the days Wilt Chamberlain played decades ago. Teams currently are shooting nearly 10 more shots per game and also 3 times more three-pointers per game than when MJ retired from the Bulls. In the 1990s, Jordan averaged over 30 points per game 5 times, but in that entire decade, only one other player averaged over 30 points in a season, and that was Karl Malone in the 1990 season. Again, 2 players over that entire decade. In the last 5 years alone of the modern NBA, 9 different players have exceeded 30 points per game. It's a much different time. So now that we've established these facts, we have to ask, why is this happening? Why is there so much more points to go around? Well, there's several reasons. For one, back when Jordan played, you used to be able to hand check players, meaning you could place your hands on the offensive player. You could even put your hands on his hip to essentially steer him to wherever you wanted him to go. As an offensive player, have you ever tried a crossover dribble while the defender's hands are literally on your midsection? It makes dribbling, playmaking, and creating space way more difficult. Second is the defensive 3-second violation. When Jordan played, the defending center could camp under the basket all game long without any penalties or drawbacks. It's one of the major reasons why the physical big man enforcer type has essentially gone extinct, because not only can you play less physically now, but you also can't just camp in the paint all game long anymore. Now, as a center, you have to be constantly moving and sometimes leave the painted area, which means it's free of defense and penetration baskets often go uncontested. We know how valuable rim protection is in the modern NBA, but it's nothing compared to how valuable it was in the 90s when a big man could essentially live there and was always waiting to meet Jordan when he attacked the rim. Third is the most obvious and referred to reason for the inflation of scoring, and it's the surge in three-point attempts. Some have used this as a reason to be skeptical that Jordan would thrive in today's NBA. A lot of people claim that Jordan was a bad three-point shooter, but that's not completely true. It was at a point, as he definitely started out as a terrible three-point shooter, but Jordan actually grew into a pretty good one as his career progressed. He had a really high three-point percentage in 1996 and 1997, but those 2 years were a short stint where the NBA actually had a shorter three-point line, so let's not include those years. From 1989 to 1993, Jordan actually shot 34.3% from three-point range. To put that in perspective, throughout Kobe's prime, he shot about the same percentage from three-point range. In LeBron's last 5 seasons, he shot nearly the same percentage as Jordan as well. So honestly, Jordan's three-point shooting woes are way overblown. He wouldn't be affected negatively in this modern three-point shooting era. With all of this being said, I think it's fair to say that naturally, Jordan's scoring and dominance would increase in today's game. But to what extent? Something that is often ignored is the rate in which the NBA changed throughout Jordan's playing days. Jordan's highest scoring season was the 86-87 season, where he averaged 37.1 points per game, and the league average per team was 109.9 points per game. 10 years later, Jordan again is leading the league in scoring, but now he's doing it at 29.6 points per game, and the league average is 96.9 points per game. So it's not like Jordan never benefited from more offense, because especially in the late 80s, the tempo was way different. The game had more possessions and revolved around fast break basketball. Things slowed down in the 90s, and instead, physical big men defined that era, which was played with way more half-court sets. If you look at James Harden's numbers in comparison to Jordan's 1987 season, you'll see that although there is an advantage in Harden's era, it's certainly more comparable. Saying Jordan would average 50 in today's NBA is probably a little much, especially when you consider this. When Phil Jackson was asked about the difference between Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan, one of the things he mentioned was that Kobe was more prone to assert his game and try to take over the game offensively, while Michael Jordan did all of his damage within the flow of the team's offense. As someone who watched both players extensively, I agree with that assessment, and it's one of the reasons that Jordan was able to be so efficient shooting the basketball even as a perimeter guard. So with that being said, it's hard for me to see a player averaging 50 in any era to be coming from a guy who plays within the flow of the offense. If I had to guess how much Michael Jordan would average in today's NBA, and I'm not talking about 98 last dance 35-year-old Jordan, I'm talking about prime scoring Michael Jordan, the one that dropped 40 points in 9 straight games, 63 in the playoffs against the number 1 ranked defense, and the MJ who averaged 42 points in a final series. In my opinion, that version of Jordan would average 40 to 43 points in today's NBA. It would be an efficient 40 points a game within the flow of the offense while being the best defender at his position. For anyone who thinks that's ridiculous, listen to this closing thought. When people say Jordan would average significantly more in today's NBA, it's not because they worship Jordan, it's because people who really know basketball recognize the nuances and greatness of Jordan's game and how that translates to the modern game. Jordan would take advantage of today's more open version of basketball because he had all the skills and was poetry in motion. The vast majority of his moves were smooth and methodical. There wasn't unnecessary dribbling, his handle was tight and calculated, his footwork was pristine and reliable, he had a fantastic hesitation dribble, and he could attack you in so many ways. If he couldn't simply elevate over you, then he would wait and shoot the ball on his descent. That's an unorthodox way of shooting the basketball, and few can hit that shot very often, but nobody did it as well as Jordan did. His fadeaway was extremely efficient and near impossible to block. As he's falling a couple feet back, while elevating as high as he does, how can the defender possibly contest it? Jordan could basically get a quality shot whenever he wanted. If he decided to attack the basket, he had one of the quickest first steps of anyone who's ever played. You could simply hack him to try to stop him from scoring, but with Jordan being an 83.5% free throw shooter, do you really think that's a legitimate solution? Not to mention how Jordan is one of the greatest ever at finishing through the contact. So even if you tried to hit him and make it more difficult in that way, many times it just turned into an and one. You couldn't play tight on him because he was too quick and would often get past you. You couldn't play off of him because he was too lethal from the perimeter. If you pushed him to his right, he had numerous counter moves to punish you. If you pushed him to his left, he also had numerous counter moves to punish you. And on top of all of this, everyone knew you shouldn't piss him off, because believe it or not, somehow that always made him even better.
Many of the greatest players in the modern game operate as the team's floor general. They might not be listed as the point guard on the scouting report, but let's make no mistake, many of these superstars are controlling the offense as if they're the team's point. What this translates to is simply higher production and higher averages across the board. Typically, when a player is appointed as a point guard or as the team's floor general, his usage rate increases as he naturally becomes a more ball-dominant player. This is one of the main reasons why players like James Harden had their assist numbers dramatically increase after being moved to the point guard position. It wasn't that he all of a sudden became a great passer, but instead, it was the fact that the offense was now ran through him, which naturally boosted his numbers. As great and as record-shattering as Jordan's numbers were, for the most part, he never had this luxury working in his favor and boosting his numbers, like many other greats have. Well, that is with the small exception of the final quarter of the 1988-89 season. At the time, the Bulls had a 34-24 record and were looking to move up in the standings. The Bulls head coach Doug Hollins noticed how Jordan had been having a significant impact in numerous ways on the court, as he was putting up his best all-around numbers of his young career. This is when Collins decided to make a significant change that was pretty uncommon during that era. Collins moved the 6'6" Jordan from his usual shooting guard position to the point guard spot as a way to pick up the tempo of the offense and allow Jordan to have more control over the game. What ensued was one of the most dominant individual stretches of NBA history. On the very first game against the Seattle Supersonics, Jordan firmly established himself as a distributor as he handed out a remarkable 15 assists. The very next game against the Indiana Pacers, Jordan had 21 points, 14 assists, and 14 rebounds in only 30 minutes of playing time due to a 32-point beatdown. He would have had a realistic shot at the historic 20-20-20 game if he had played his regular workload of minutes. Jordan remained at the point guard position for the final 24 games of the season, and in those games, he averaged 30.4 points, 9.2 rebounds, 10.7 assists, and 2.5 steals on 49.8% shooting. To go along with this ridiculous near triple-double average, Jordan had a streak of 7 straight triple-doubles and 10 triple-doubles in 11 games. In the game that Jordan didn't get a triple-double, he poured in 40 points, 11 assists, and 7 rebounds on 61.1% shooting. On another night, in a 15-point victory against the Blazers, Jordan dropped 34 points, 17 assists, 7 rebounds, and 6 steals on 50% shooting. Those 17 assists were his career high. This game against Portland was also the beginning of an incredible streak that I rarely hear anyone mention. Over a 12-game stretch, Jordan had at least 10 assists in every single contest. To put in perspective just how incredible that 12-game streak is, consider the fact that all-time great distributors and stat stuffers Russell Westbrook, James Harden, and Jason Kidd have never had a streak longer than MJ's of games with at least 10 assists. To put it simply, Michael Jordan wasn't just great at the point guard position, but he appeared to be playing like he was the greatest point guard of all time. This was just one end of the court though. Despite spending so much energy on offense as a point guard, Jordan still had the responsibility of locking down opposing perimeter players, and unlike players who use their offensive load as an excuse for their lack of defensive intensity, Jordan still brought it on the defensive end every single night. Not only was Jordan 3rd overall in steals per game, but he also finished that season on the NBA's first team all-defense. He was 5th overall in defensive win shares, 1st overall in defensive plus-minus, and finished that season in the 5th spot for the NBA's Defensive Player of the Year. Jordan and the Bulls made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals, where they were eliminated in 6 games by the bad boy Detroit Pistons. After yet another defeat at the hand of Detroit, Chicago's management decided that it was time to shake things up and fired Doug Collins from his head coaching position. He was replaced with the legendary Phil Jackson, and thus the triangle offense was implemented, and Jordan's days as a point guard were now behind him. Jordan's numbers at the point were utterly insane, but let's be honest, his numbers earlier that season, before he switched positions, were pretty nuts too. The major what-if question that this video raises is what if Jordan had remained at the point guard position throughout his career? How would that have affected his career numbers? Well, at the very least, we can make an educated guess based on how Jordan's numbers adjusted during the 1989 season. You'll see that from his 57 games as the shooting guard to his 24 games as the point guard, his scoring decreased by about 9%. His rebounding increased by around 17%, and his assists dramatically increased by a whopping 35%. So now, if we take those same percentages and apply them to Jordan's career numbers, we're now looking at averages of 27.4 points, 7.3 rebounds, and 7.2 assists per game. What I can't help but notice is how Jordan's career numbers as a point guard are strikingly similar to another all-time great who consistently ran his offense like a quarterback, and that is LeBron James. With MJ's adjusted averages, their career numbers are now nearly identical to one another. Obviously, over time, this change in playstyle could have affected other aspects of Jordan's game, like an increase in turnovers, potentially more injuries due to his increased workload, and maybe he even wins less championships as a point guard rather than playing within the system of the triangle offense. It's impossible to say for sure, but at the very least, this perfectly summarizes how a player's perception, production, and impact can dramatically change with a simple switch of a position. Amongst basketball fans, it's common knowledge that Michael Jordan was the ultimate competitor and always looked for some kind of angle to motivate himself to become better than his opponent. It was basically the theme of his career, to such a point that it became a meme after the world witnessed The Last Dance documentary. Despite all of this, I've never seen a video about the first instance in the NBA where Jordan took something from a competitor personally. That's where this video comes in, as we evaluate the revenge game of a rookie who was still yet to make his mark on the sports world. It's the night of November 1st, 1984, and the Bulls are in Denver, Colorado for an early season matchup with the contending Denver Nuggets. The young Michael Jordan only had 4 regular season games under his belt at this point, and after those first 4, he was averaging about 25 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists on 46% shooting. He definitely hadn't yet become the icon that we know today, but with these first 4 games, people could tell that he was definitely an elite talent and a rising star in this league that defenses had to take note of. On this night, the player who had the assignment of guarding Jordan was the 6'4" shooting guard Theodore Roosevelt Dunn, more commonly referred to as T.R. Dunn. The veteran Dunn was one of the best defensive players in the entire league at this point, as he had made the NBA's All-Defense team in the previous 2 seasons, and he would go on to earn a selection this year as well. Both Jordan and Dunn were looking forward to that night's solo battle, as one of the best scoring guards was facing one of the best perimeter defenders. Once the game began, Jordan had his moments with some of the incredibly athletic moves that you would expect from a young Michael Jordan. But what some may find surprising is that Dunn actually got the last laugh, as he contained Jordan well below his average, as MJ had one of his worst games of the year, scoring only 17 points on 7-15 from the field. He didn't look like the best player on the court that night, as 5 other players outscored him, and as a result, the Bulls were handily defeated with a final score of 129-113. This embarrassing loss stuck with MJ, and according to former Bulls assistant coach Fred Carter, Jordan never forgot about this game where he was contained by T.R. Dunn. Since it was an out-of-conference matchup, the Bulls and Nuggets would only play each other twice this season, and the second matchup wouldn't come until a couple months later. On January 14, 1985, the Bulls and Nuggets were set to square off again, this time in Chicago Stadium. For T.R. Dunn, it was just another night of being assigned to guard one of the premier scorers of the league. But for Michael Jordan, this was the game he had circled on his calendar for the last couple of months, and had been on his mind throughout. Unfortunately, this was one of those legendary games that we have absolutely no footage of, which is actually pretty common for Michael Jordan's early career. This probably has a lot to do with why no one ever talks about this game. Regardless, we still know how this evening went for both Jordan and Dunn. This game was close at the end of the first half, but in the third quarter, Jordan rolled his ankle and was dealing with a significant amount of pain. The Bulls coaching staff tried to convince Jordan to sit out the rest of the game, but according to the assistant coach Fred Carter, Jordan kept saying, "I gotta play, I gotta play," as his mind was focused on earning the victory and getting his revenge on T.R. Dunn. Apparently, the ankle injury was so bad that Carter even went as far as saying that no one else would have been able to play through it. But a young and fiercely competitive Michael Jordan was not so easily deterred. Not only did Jordan continue to play through the pain, but he completely erupted in the fourth quarter, ultimately leading his Bulls to a 122-113 victory. Jordan finished with 35 points, 15 assists, 14 rebounds, and 3 steals on 68.8% shooting. He led all players in points, assists, and rebounds. Not only was this Jordan's first revenge game that we know of, but it was also the very first triple-double of his career, which is something that he would do quite a few times afterwards. Assistant coach Fred Carter said that the message to T.R. Dunn was sent and received, as Jordan vanquished his first victim of his extremely vindictive career.
It's a short and sweet video, but I thought it would be cool to cover one of the rarely discussed moments of Michael Jordan's career, while also giving some attention to one of the great forgotten defenders of NBA history.
When some fans think of Michael Jordan's most incredible seasons, they usually think of his championship seasons with Phil Jackson, where Scottie Pippen had developed into a legitimate co-star and where Horace Grant had emerged as a third scoring option. But I would argue that from an individual perspective, MJ's most incredible season came long before all of that. In his first 3 seasons as a pro, Jordan took the league by storm. But what he did in his 4th year was on another level entirely. It's important to note that this was not the Chicago Bulls dynasty that people would come to know. Not a single player other than Jordan was an NBA All-Star. And in fact, outside of a 38-year-old Artis Gilmore, who averaged just 4 points, no player other than Jordan had ever been an All-Star in the entirety of their careers up to that point. The Bulls' second leading scorer was the 6'2" guard named Sam Vincent. Up to that point, Vincent was a guy who had never averaged at least 10 points per game, and was also a player who struggled to stay on the floor due to injuries. To say that Jordan would need to carry this squad in order for them to make the playoffs would be a tremendous understatement. In the previous season, Jordan had taken a massive step forward defensively, as he led all guards in blocks and was second overall in steals, yet he didn't make the NBA's first or second all-defense team. Knowing MJ, he probably took that personally, and used it as motivation heading into the 87-88 season. On both ends of the court, Jordan stormed out of the gates, like he was a man hell-bent on revenge, as he was locking down opposing superstars while torching them on offense. MJ played all 82 games, and by the end of the regular season, he put up averages of 35 points, 5.5 rebounds, 5.9 assists, 3.2 steals, and 1.6 blocks on 53.5% shooting. Throughout the regular season, MJ won basically everything he possibly could have. He was the scoring champion, he was the steals champion, he won the NBA's dunk contest, he was the All-Star Game MVP, he was the Defensive Player of the Year, and he was the league MVP. The amount of records he set this season was insane. He became the first player in NBA history to win MVP and Defensive Player of the Year in the same season. He's the only player who's ever averaged at least 30 points in a season while winning DPOY. And again, Jordan averaged 35. And his 1.6 blocks per game was the highest average by a guard in NBA history. I should also mention that only a third of the way into the regular season, the Bulls traded the 38-year-old Artis Gilmore, which means that Jordan led a team with no All-Stars and with players who had never been All-Stars to a remarkable 50-32 record, which was good enough for the 3rd seed in the Eastern Conference. That right there is the definition of a carry. People rarely mention this, but MJ's incredible run didn't simply end with his record-breaking regular season, but he continued his dominance into the first round of the playoffs. Against the 6th-seeded Cleveland Cavaliers, Jordan scored 50 points in the series opener. In the very next game, Jordan dropped 55 points, becoming the first and only player to ever score 50 points in back-to-back playoff games. By his standards, he had a disappointing performance in Game 3 and scored only 38 points. Jordan led Chicago to a dominating series victory, defeating the Cavs in just 5 games. These were Jordan's numbers in each of those 5 games, and his averages for the series as a whole. His 45.2 points per game average is the highest ever in a 5-game playoff series, and the fact that he did that on 56% shooting as a shooting guard is utterly insane. Finally, the momentum came to a halt in the Eastern Conference semifinals, where the Bulls ran into the vastly more talented Detroit Pistons. Jordan still did what he could as he put up these strong numbers that series, but it wasn't nearly enough as the title-contending Pistons closed it out in just 5 games. I've heard people argue about which version of MJ is the best, 91, 96, or 98. I understand that those versions won the championship, but for myself personally, there's no way I'm taking anything other than the record-breaking, two-way dominating 1988 version.
It's one of the biggest what-ifs of NBA history, and one of the biggest arguments that Jordan stans will make in favor of their hero.
The narrative is that if Michael Jordan never retired at the end of the 1993 season to go play baseball, then his Bulls would have won the championship in 94 and 95, equaling 8 straight titles for the Bulls from 1991 to 1998. At first glance, it makes sense why many people would make that assumption. During Jordan's reign, he was clearly the league's best player and had no equal. Once Scottie Pippen was completely healthy and rose to all-star status, they began winning championships and almost never looked back. The thing is, there is a lot of variables in this scenario, and since we're talking about the legacies of several players involved, I think the topic deserves more in-depth analysis. Several YouTubers have covered this topic already, including an excellent video from Rusty Buckets, which I recommend checking out. I agree with almost everything he says. With that being said, this is my personal take, and I believe I have a unique perspective to offer on the matter, and I'm also curious to hear your thoughts in the comments below. First off, players constantly talk about how hard it is to win 3 championships in a row. Other than the Chicago Bulls, only the Celtics of the 60s and the Lakers of the early 2000s have been able to do it. There are a number of other teams that we've described as dynasties but never achieved the feat. Although the Bulls three-peated twice, winning 8 in a row is something else entirely. With each trip through the playoffs and into the finals, there's more wear and tear on the team as a whole, and the team has less time to recoup and recover in the offseason. Players have spoken about this championship fatigue many times, but imagine the pressure and labor of having to defend your title 7 times straight. Not only that, but there's also the aspect of team motivation in comparison to team complacency. Sitting on the mountaintop over and over again can make you become relaxed and complacent. It's hard to envision the Bulls being as hungry as the 28 other teams in the league if they're winning for nearly a decade straight. But if there's a player and leader other than Bill Russell who could pull that off, my money would be on Michael Jordan. So it's tough to say how much a lack of motivation and championship fatigue could play a role, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. Another aspect and narrative was that Michael Jordan was rusty for the Bulls' playoff run in 1995. Jordan retired in the summer of 1993. He missed the entirety of the 93-94 season, but he actually rejoined the Bulls with 17 games left in the 94-95 regular season. Although Jordan was still lethal, and although he had signature performances, like his 55 points just a few games into his return, overall, there was still some signs of rust. In the 17 games Jordan played in the 95 regular season, Jordan averaged 26.9 points on 41% shooting. Seems like nice numbers, but those are weak by Jordan's standards. Throughout his career up to the 95 comeback, Jordan had averaged nearly 6 more points and was more than 10% more efficient from the field. Even his free throw shooting was almost 5% worse than his career average. Some people will point out that his numbers did pick up from the regular season into the 95 playoffs, which is true as he averaged 31.5 points, 6.5 rebounds, 4.5 assists on 48.4% shooting. But as impressive as these numbers look, believe it or not, these were also well below Jordan's normal averages in the playoffs. He was averaging a few less points, slightly less rebounds, fewer assists, and wasn't shooting as efficiently. Jordan was even averaging significantly more turnovers, which is typically a sign of sloppiness, and dare I say, even rustiness. Beyond even all the numbers was what people were witnessing with their own eyes. Throughout the 95 season, people in the basketball community were saying that Michael Jordan didn't look like the Michael Jordan we were used to. He wasn't putting up his usual numbers, he wasn't taking over games to the same extent as before, and more importantly, he wasn't making clutch plays when it mattered most, and was even making mistakes that cost his team. And due to this, and a couple other factors we'll get into, the Bulls lost in 6 games to a great Magic team in the 95 semifinals. Even Nick Anderson of the Orlando Magic said that the 45 Jordan wasn't as good as the 23 Jordan. All of this leads me to believe that Michael Jordan was in fact rusty. I mean, to even suggest that a player who rejoins his team with 17 games left in the season, having missed training camp, and chemistry building games with his new teammates, after playing a completely different sport for the last year and a half, could simply jump into the starting lineup and be the same player seems crazy to me. Now that doesn't mean that we need to pretend that this series never happened, or just ignore it when it comes to evaluating Jordan's legacy. This series still happened, but what it does mean is that in a hypothetical scenario where Jordan doesn't retire in 93, we would definitely be getting a sharper Jordan in 95. With that being said, there are still a couple other gigantic factors in whether or not the Bulls could have won 8 straight. If a Michael Jordan-led Bulls team made it to the NBA Finals in 1994 and 1995, standing in their way would have been an opponent they've never faced on that stage before, the Houston Rockets. The Rockets were incredibly strong at a position the Bulls were not, the center position. Hakeem Olajuwon is one of the greatest players of all time on both sides of the basketball. During Hakeem's championship runs in 94 and 95, he had historic performances where he torched the likes of Shaquille O'Neal, Patrick Ewing, and David Robinson. If those legends couldn't contain Olajuwon, then a 36-year-old Bill Cartwright certainly wouldn't have either. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Bulls couldn't handle teams with dominant big men. The Bulls had also continuously eliminated Eastern Conference powerhouses led by Patrick Ewing, Shaquille O'Neal, and Alonzo Mourning. But a prime Hakeem is something else entirely. He definitely would have got his. Surrounding Hakeem were several other quality shooters and perimeter defenders. 1994 would have been a colossal finals matchup between two of the best teams from each conference. The Bulls would have been led by their core of Jordan, Pippen, and Horace Grant, while the Rockets would be led by Hakeem, Robert Horry, Otis Thorpe, and Vernon Maxwell. It's very possible that the Bulls make up the gap at the center position and still manage to win the series, but this would certainly have been their biggest challenge yet. Now the Bulls have hypothetically defeated the Rockets to win their 4th straight championship, but this now brings us to the biggest factor in the Bulls' quest to win 8 straight titles. Let's jump back into our reality where Jordan did retire to play baseball. Context is extremely important here. The Bulls were led by their dynamic duo of Jordan and Pippen for their championship runs in 91, 92, and 93, but often overlooked was their starting power forward and their 3rd best player during those championship runs, Horace Grant. Horace not only contributed significantly on offense during those years, averaging around 15 points a game, but he was also pivotal to the Bulls' success with his interior defense. Grant was around in Chicago for 1 year after Jordan's retirement, where his and Pippen's 93-94 Bulls made it to the Eastern Conference semifinals before they were eliminated in 7 games by Patrick Ewing's New York Knicks. After the season was over, Grant enters into free agency, and now Grant is looking around the Bulls organization, and unfortunately he sees no Michael Jordan, but he sees Jerry Krause, a general manager who basically none of the players like. He sees Scottie Pippen, who's a questionable leader to say the least, who's frustrated with the organization and feuding with management and may get traded at any point. And all of this tells Grant that this organization is headed downhill, and the time to get out is now. As a result, Grant leaves Chicago in the summer of 94, which looks like a brilliant move at the time. He left a Chicago squad who wasn't winning any championships without Jordan, and he was joining the new rising power in the East, the Shaq and Penny Orlando Magic. If Jordan never retires and the Bulls are coming off their 4th straight championship heading into the summer of 94, well then there is almost certainly no way Horace Grant ever leaves the Bulls for the Magic in free agency. Remember, this is the same Magic team in 95 that now had Grant that went on to beat the Bulls in 6 games just shortly after Jordan's comeback. Grant switching sides was a huge factor in this series. If Grant is a member of the Bulls' Big Three instead of the Magic's, well then the Bulls may end up winning that series. If Grant never leaves the Bulls because Jordan never retires, then the Bulls don't have an opening or even a need at the power forward position. But in hindsight, this fact is actually devastating to the Bulls in the long run. The Bulls did have a need at the power forward position because of the void left by Grant, and that's why they traded for Dennis Rodman in the summer of 95. At the time, the Rodman trade was actually quite controversial for Chicago. Rodman was seen as a head case and a loose cannon. Maybe Phil Jackson could handle Rodman, but we didn't know that then. Some people even thought that Rodman could be the thing that destroys the Bulls organization from the inside, and there were decent reasons to speculate that. The 2 years before Rodman joined the Bulls, he had had plenty of off-the-court issues. He served suspensions, he had been violent on the court, he had been in a motorcycle accident, and so on. Calling him a potential distraction is putting it lightly. With Grant still in Chicago, there isn't a hole in the Bulls starting lineup, so they're never desperate enough to risk the Rodman trade in the first place. So now, without Rodman, not only are we not sure if the Bulls win in 94 and 95 against the Rockets, but now we're not even sure if they're winning in 96, 97, and 98 against the Sonics and Jazz. Many people believe Rodman should have been the Finals MVP in 96 instead of Jordan. That's how impactful and crucial he was to their success. So with all of this considered, ultimately my conclusion is the Bulls would have likely not won 8 straight championships if Jordan never retired to play baseball, even if it means they win in 94 and 95. Now, is this statement a fact? Of course not. It's simply my opinion based on the information we have. Honestly though, I think it's funny how the biggest Jordan fans have to argue so strongly for the 8 straight narrative, as if 2 3-peats in 8 years isn't enough to prove that Jordan is the GOAT.
I felt like we were in a position to win, and we pushed them to a Game 7 in their building.
That's the Scotty migraine game, right?
Yeah.
Heading into the 1989 to 1990 season, the Chicago Bulls were coming off of their second straight year being eliminated at the hands of the Detroit Pistons. Chicago had also fired Doug Collins from his head coaching position and promoted Phil Jackson to lead the team moving forward. It was a controversial move at the time, but ultimately a brilliant one that would pay off almost immediately. Along with that, Scottie Pippen was a bit of a slow bloomer, but was now poised to have his breakout season. He improved all of his averages across the board and experienced his first season as an NBA All-Star. This would be the first time Jordan would play alongside of another All-Star. Behind the lead of Michael Jordan and his monstrous numbers, the Bulls won 55 games, which was the second most in franchise history. They certainly weren't favorites in the East heading into the postseason, but they had greatly improved, and it was starting to look like they might actually be ready to finally dethrone their rivals, the reigning Detroit Pistons. After getting a gentleman's sweep over the Bucks and 76ers in the first 2 rounds, the Bulls were meeting the Pistons for the 3rd straight year, this time in the Eastern Conference Finals. It was a hotly contested series, but at the end of Game 6, they were tied at 3 games apiece, with the series heading back to Detroit to decide who goes to the NBA Finals, where it was anyone's game. There were 2 major issues for Chicago heading into that 7th game. The first was the absence of their starting point guard, John Paxson. He injured his right ankle in the 3rd quarter of Game 6, and from that point on, his season was done. John was one of the Bulls' best perimeter shooters, and to say the Bulls would miss that aspect of his skill set in Game 7 would be a massive understatement. More on that later. Their second major issue was the well-documented Scottie Pippen migraine. Pippen described his symptoms as seeing double, blurred vision, and numbing pain. Unfortunately, when the game started, Pippen was unable to make a positive impact on either side of the court, shooting only 1 for 10 from the field for a grand total of 2 points, while simultaneously being outproduced by his defensive assignment, Dennis Rodman, who put in 13 points and 9 rebounds on a near-perfect 6 of 7 shooting from the field. Jordan was playing the biggest game of his career up to that point without his number 2 option and without his starting point guard, who was a great perimeter threat as well. Given the circumstances, MJ would have to have a tremendous game for the Bulls just to keep things interesting, and a great game is what he had. Despite the elite Detroit defense, Jordan poured in 31 points, 9 assists, and 8 rebounds on 48% shooting. Sadly, this was nowhere close to enough, because it wasn't just Pippen who appeared to be having a migraine, but it almost seemed like every other Bulls player did as well. Horace Grant was the only Bull other than Jordan to score in double digits, and he shot a terrible 3 of 17 from the field. As I mentioned earlier, Pippen shot 1 of 10, Greg Hodges shot 3 of 13, Bill Cartwright shot 3 of 9, and BJ Armstrong shot 1 of 8. All of the Bulls other than Jordan shot a combined 23.8% from the field. That wasn't just terrible, but collectively, it was one of the worst performances from a supporting cast in playoff history. Watching the game again recently was absolutely brutal. The Chicago role players couldn't hit a perimeter shot to save their life. It's remarkable that Jordan even managed to get 9 assists out of that group, considering the fact that the majority of his teammates' shots were bricks. If Chicago had made just an average amount of their jumpers, Jordan would have easily had 15+ assists that game. As I said earlier, John Paxson was missed quite dearly. When you factor in Jordan's assists and points, he orchestrated a whopping 67% of all of his team's points. It wasn't just offensively where Jordan must have felt alone, but defensively as well. Jordan locked up Joe Dumars, who was the team's second best player and their number 2 scoring option, while pretty much every other Piston who played major minutes was very productive. Dumars shot only 2 of 7 from the field and had only 7 points, while Isaiah Thomas had 21, Rodman had 13, Lambeer had 13, Sally had 14, and Mark Aguirre had 15. The Pistons outside of Dumars shot a tremendous 54% from the field. Despite MJ's best efforts, the Pistons were ahead comfortably for most of the second half and ultimately won the game with a score of 93-74. The Pistons then went on to beat the Portland Trail Blazers in the 1990 NBA Finals. It's crazy to look back and see that if the Bulls hadn't had multiple extremely untimely injuries and if Jordan had even just a bit of help, there's a strong likelihood he would have won 7 championship rings instead of 6.
This game is one of the huge reasons why I never agreed with the narrative that Jordan started winning championships when he started trusting his teammates. Jordan had plenty of times early in his career where he looked to facilitate and trusted his teammates with the game on the line. He averaged 7 assists over the entirety of the 1990 playoffs, which is extremely high for a shooting guard, especially during that era. In that deciding 7th game specifically, Jordan managed 9 assists with teammates who shot 23%. Despite the fact that that game had a giant magnitude, Jordan frequently kept looking to his teammates even though they kept letting him down. He often relied on them and they still lost. 1 year later, the Bulls as a whole, not just Jordan, came back stronger, healthier, and more prepared. They swept the Pistons in the 91 playoffs and the championships started stacking up from then on. So no, Jordan didn't start winning championships when he started trusting his teammates. Jordan started winning championships when he finally got an adequate supporting cast that's necessary for winning the championship.
They're the two greatest shooting guards of basketball history, and although they sometimes appeared as mirror images of one another in terms of style, mentality, and personality, both individuals were actually much more different than the fans typically recognize. I've witnessed countless hours of both of these legends playing the game of basketball, and today, I'm breaking down every major difference that I could recognize in how the two approached and played the game. Obviously, this is just my own limited perspective, so let me know in the comments what are some differences that you've noticed. Number 1. Michael Jordan had much bigger hands. To people who don't know basketball on a deep level, this might initially seem like an insignificant detail, but it's actually quite the opposite. Phil Jackson has spoken in depth about the advantages Jordan had due to his monstrous hands, and even Jordan himself has elaborated on the edge it gave over the competition. Jordan's hands weren't just large for his stature, but he actually had some of the largest hands of any player of NBA history. With Jordan's massive mitts, he could easily palm and control the basketball, and he could use greater pump fakes and misdirect players more easily. It also allowed him to effortlessly alter and change his shot in midair, which would certainly be more difficult for players who had less control of the basketball due to their smaller hands. And obviously, in an era of hand checking, it made Jordan even more difficult defensively. In an interview in 2013, Kobe spoke about the difficulties of developing his game without that inherent advantage, saying, "Michael was blessed with massive hands, and Dr. J as well. I wasn't. I have big hands, but Jordan and Irving can literally pick up the ball like an orange. So I've had to do things to strengthen my hands, strengthen my forearms, to make sure that I have the grip to be able to do it. They obviously had the natural capabilities to do it. I had to work to get the strength to be able to do it." Number 2. Kobe was a harder worker. This is certainly a bold claim, and isn't meant as a slight to MJ, as he's certainly one of the hardest working basketball players that the game has ever seen. But on the other hand, Kobe has an argument for being the hardest working athlete of all time. As I mentioned in a previous video, the great Phil Jackson made this bold claim himself, which is quite stunning since he spent all of his coaching career with Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. Feel free to pause the video for more time to read Phil Jackson's full quote. As legendary as Kobe's drive was, I could even argue that it was sometimes a negative for Kobe, as he pushed himself so hard that it sometimes had lingering effects on his body. The Mamba was known to play through injury, play heavy minutes, put an insane amount of time into the gym, and apparently lived most of his basketball life on only 4 hours of sleep each night. With an insane work ethic like that, it's no wonder why he's one of the greatest players of all time. But then again, it also makes sense why he dealt with so many injuries throughout his career, considering the fact that he willingly put so much strain on his body. Number 3. Kobe was a better perimeter shooter. Numerous people have made the same conclusion, including Michael Jordan's longtime teammate, Scottie Pippen. When you look at their three-point percentage next to one another, Kobe has a very slight advantage, and it's so close that you could basically call it a tie. But one of the key differences was the fact that Kobe had a much higher tendency of shooting three-pointers, as he shot more than 3 times as many as Jordan did over the course of his career. Some of that has to do with the surge in three-point attempts as the game has evolved, but even if you adjust for inflation, Kobe still had a higher tendency of three-point attempts. Analytics have proven that as you take more shots, percentages generally decrease, because you can be less selective with your opportunities, and yet despite that, the Mamba maintains his edge. The perimeter shot advantage isn't just about three-pointers though. Kobe loved to take shots in rhythm just a step or two inside of the three-point line. The Mamba was excellent at these shots, whether he was open or contested.
With that being said, analytics show that generally these are the most inefficient shots on the court, mostly because of their distance and lower conversion rate, while still being worth only 2 points. Which brings us to the next difference. Number 4. Michael Jordan had better shot selection. It's no secret that Michael was a more efficient scorer than Kobe Bryant, averaging 30 points per game over the course of his career on nearly 50% shooting. A big reason for Jordan's significant edge over Kobe in field goal efficiency was because of MJ's sound decision making. Although Michael is famous for making some difficult shots, he certainly wasn't seeking them out. In his younger years, Jordan scored a large portion of his points in the paint and from the free throw line. As he aged, his game became more about the mid-range, and he rarely settled for more difficult opportunities, as he used his high basketball IQ to put himself in good positions to score. Although Kobe had many of these same skills as Jordan, the Mamba's supreme confidence led him to take a tremendous amount of difficult shots that most players wouldn't attempt. During his prime, it was common on a nightly basis for him to shoot through double teams, take heavily contested and off-balance shots from the perimeter, and he took a ton of what us hoopers would call heat check shots. Once again, Phil Jackson gave his own perspective on this topic, and said that Jordan always played within the flow of the team's offense and rarely tried to force anything, while Kobe may have been the more explosive player, but he also had a strong tendency of trying to force the situation and take over games offensively. Number 5. Jordan was the more durable athlete. I somewhat alluded to this earlier, but Kobe was dealing with injuries throughout the majority of his career and caused him to miss well over 100 games. Even in the games where he played, he was often dealing with nagging pain in his hands, wrists, shoulders, knees, and ankles. On the other hand, other than Jordan's second season with a broken foot, he rarely missed any games due to an injury and was often performing at full strength. In fact, excluding his second season, Jordan missed only 7 out of a possible 919 games with the Bulls. This was a testament to his stellar conditioning and his God-given athleticism. Number 6. Kobe was better with his left hand. It's not like there's any fancy left-handed specific stats that I can share with you guys, but you'll just have to take my word for it on this one. Now, Jordan has possibly the greatest layup package in NBA history, and a major aspect of that was his incredible ability to finish the play with his left hand. If that was the only aspect we were looking at, then this advantage would go to Jordan. But I'm pretty sure that Kobe still could have been a legit star even if he had to use his left hand as his dominant hand. The Mamba was working on his left-handed game from an extremely early age. When he broke his right hand, he showed up to Lakers practice and shot entirely with his left hand. And when he injured his right shoulder, he played a significant amount of a regular season game with only his left hand. And of course, many of us remember the ridiculous turnaround left-handed 3 against the Dallas Mavericks. If Kobe had to play a mid-range game as a left-handed shooter, he's one of the few stars who I believe could still be a successful scorer. Number 7. Michael Jordan had a greater vertical leap. Vertical leap comparisons are usually a sure way to get comment sections in heated debates, because it's hard to get credible and precise estimations of each player's leap. With that being said, most listings have Jordan's leap between 46 and 48 inches, while Kobe's is listed around only 38 inches. Even by just the eye test, it's not hard to see how Jordan could have such a tremendous vertical, considering his iconic and comfortably stylish free throw line dunks, and also how Jordan made his hang time famous by appearing to simply wait in the air for his defender to make his descent. Number 8. Michael Jordan is a more competitive person. Whether this is an advantage for MJ or a problem for MJ is really up to your interpretation. When it comes to their mentalities on the basketball court, both players were about as competitive, driven, and intense as a player could possibly be, but off the court is another story. In Kobe Bryant's own words, Michael Jordan was a more competitive person, from the standpoint that Jordan was competitive about more things. I don't think Kobe would have ever conceded that anyone cared more about the outcome of a basketball game than he did. But in an interview, Kobe explained that he's only extremely competitive about the things he cares about, while Jordan is competitive in absolutely everything. Kobe gave a funny example of a time the two athletes were out to dinner together and how Jordan would eat the food quickly just to finish his meal before Kobe did. There's many more differences between these two great basketball legends, but these were the biggest ones in my opinion.
After the Bulls won their sixth championship ring in 1998, the team imploded due to turmoil between the general manager, the coaches, and the players. Most basketball fans know the details about why this team disbanded, and if you watched the Last Dance documentary that released a few years ago, then you certainly know all about it. But if you don't know the details, you can watch my summarized version with this video. Now, towards the end of that documentary, Michael Jordan talked about how frustrated he was that his Bulls didn't get a chance to win a seventh championship ring in 1999. Phil Jackson retired due to pressure from general manager Jerry Krause. Without Phil Jackson around, Jordan decided to retire from basketball. Without Jordan around, Bulls management determined that they couldn't compete for championships. So they traded Scottie Pippen and Steve Kerr, and they released Dennis Rodman. Jordan was convinced that if Phil Jackson hadn't been pushed out of his coaching position, that entire squad would have returned for a chance to compete for a seventh ring in 1999, and he believed they likely would have won another championship. But is he right? Would the Bulls have won a fourth straight title to close out their dynasty on an even more legendary note? Well, I actually believe this answer is a bit more complicated than people usually recognize. There's a lot of nuance to this hypothetical question, and although there is absolutely no way we can get a definitive answer to something that never happened, at the very least, I can make an educated guess based on the information in front of us. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing we have to do is look at the state of the Chicago Bulls team at the end of the 1998 season. We'll start with Michael Jordan. MJ was 35 years old and had just finished his 13th season in the NBA. Jordan would have turned 36 during the 1998 to 1999 regular season. Now, in those 98 finals against Utah, Jordan was extremely tired as he had just led the Bulls to their third straight deep postseason run. Although MJ was quickly approaching his late 30s, he believed he was at his very peak of his basketball abilities, at least from the perspective of his basketball IQ, and in his ability to execute what he wanted. Regardless of the fact that it was his final season in Chicago, he was the league MVP, he was the league's leading scorer, he was first team all-defense, he was the All-Star Game MVP, and he was the Finals MVP. So in a sense, MJ might have been correct about this being his peak. Now, Michael Jordan was certainly exhausted at the end of these NBA Finals. But that wasn't just because he was much older at this point in his career, but it had a lot to do with the fact that he had to take on a greater load throughout that season than usual. Scottie Pippen was recovering from surgery throughout the 1998 regular season, which meant that Jordan had to play more minutes and utilize more energy in order to win 60 basketball games. In those NBA Finals, Scottie Pippen was dealing with back pain, which caused MJ to have to carry the Bulls team offensively to an even greater extent, as he averaged 33 of the Bulls' 88 points in that final series. So although MJ was understandably very exhausted, I don't see that as an indication that he didn't have much left in the tank for 1999, but rather I saw that as a symptom of his extremely unique situation throughout the 1998 regular season. In my opinion, Jordan would have been his usual dominant self in the 1999 season, and was certainly up to the task of winning a 7th ring. So now let's look at Scottie Pippen. Obviously, Scottie was mostly a shell of his usual self towards the end of the Bulls' championship run, as his brutal back pain caused him to act as a decoy in Game 6 of those NBA Finals. With that being said, Scottie's health recovered almost completely in time for the 1998-99 season. The biggest piece of evidence for that statement is the fact that Scottie didn't miss a single game for the Rockets throughout the entirety of his 98-99 season. But it is worth mentioning that Pippen looked as if he had lost a small step due to his increasing age, as he averaged nearly 5 points per game less with the Rockets, and his efficiency from the field took a bit of a dip as well. His Rockets only made it to the first round of the playoffs, where they were eliminated by Shaq and Kobe's Lakers. In that postseason, Scottie was quite inconsistent. For example, in Game 2, he completely disappeared, scoring only 3 points on 0 of 7 shooting in 37 minutes of action. But in the very next game, he put up a career performance, dropping 37 points, 13 rebounds, and 4 assists, while playing all 48 minutes in a blowout victory. So at the very least, Scottie was extremely streaky at this point in his career, but to a certain extent, that was always an aspect of his game throughout his playing days. In conclusion, Pippen would have definitely lost a step in 1999 and wouldn't have been as much of a sure thing as Michael Jordan. Now let's look at Dennis Rodman. Of the Bulls' three-headed monster, Rodman was the oldest player, and if the Bulls were to make it all the way to the NBA Finals in 1999, Rodman would have been 38 years old before that series even started. Generally speaking, players in the 90s didn't age as gracefully as they do today, especially a guy like Rodman who leaned heavily upon his strength, quickness, and athleticism. Of the three stars, his decline in basketball skills was certainly the most evident. Some people forget this, but he was losing some of his edge even in the 1998 postseason. In that final series against Utah, Rodman played more than 30 minutes in only 2 out of the 6 games. Along with that, in only 2 out of those 6 games did he reach double-digit rebounds. This decline was not only evident in his level of production, but it was also evident to Phil Jackson, which is why he was significantly decreasing his minutes. Just like Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman actually played in the 1998 to 1999 season for another team, as Dennis was a member of the Los Angeles Lakers. The thing is, it's really difficult to gauge what player Rodman would have been on the Bulls in 1999 based on what he was for the Lakers that season. To put it simply, Rodman's stint in Los Angeles was a nightmarish roller coaster. They won their first 10 games straight with Dennis in the purple and gold, but once he became a disruption in the locker room, things became dysfunctional soon after that. Rodman was saying that he needed vacation time in Vegas, while claiming that Kobe and Shaq were jealous of his luxurious lifestyle. Kobe and the rest of the organization were questioning his commitment to the team, and Shaq is on record for saying that Rodman was the worst teammate that he's ever had. After Rodman had missed yet another Lakers practice, LA's management became fed up with his antics, and released the star forward just as the playoffs were set to begin. Now here's the thing, Kurt Rambis was filling in as the Lakers' interim head coach, and was completely unqualified to handle all of these egos. With the psychologically brilliant Phil Jackson as the head coach, and with Michael Jordan and Scottie as familiar teammates, I don't see Rodman having these same issues with the Bulls in 1999. In conclusion, the Bulls would have had a productive Rodman in 1999, but he would have certainly been a significant step slower and less productive than the team was accustomed to. So now that we've looked at the Bulls' 3 stars, let's dive into the details of the 98 to 99 basketball season as a whole. What people often forget is that the 98 to 99 basketball season was a lockout-shortened season, where only 50 regular season games were played, compared to the usual 82. Now at first glance, you would think that a shortened season would actually work as an advantage to an older Chicago Bulls team, who could greatly benefit from more nights off. I honestly don't think that could be farther from the truth. The key detail here is that because of the lockout, regular season basketball games didn't start until February 5th, 1999. Which is roughly 4 months later than when basketball season usually starts. Due to this, the NBA schedule was way more brutal than ever before, as each team had to play 50 games in just 90 days. Instead of just back-to-backs, in many cases, teams had to play games on 3 straight nights. This was a brutal schedule for everyone, but for a very old team like the Bulls, who had just played basketball for 3 long championship seasons, this highly condensed season would have been especially draining. Now before you completely write off the Bulls for the unfavorable schedule, consider this. The strength of the competition certainly wasn't as formidable in the Eastern Conference compared to years past. Patrick Ewing had an ongoing Achilles injury that forced him to sit out in the playoffs. Shaquille O'Neal had left Orlando for Los Angeles several years earlier, and the top-seeded Miami Heat were shockingly eliminated in the first round by the 8th-seeded New York Knicks. Eventually, it was that 8th-seeded Knicks who made it to the finals out of the East, even though they were without arguably their best player, Patrick Ewing. Simply put, the Eastern Conference was wide open for the Bulls' taking. And even if the Chicago group wasn't as good as any of their 6 previous championship teams, I still believe they would have been good enough to get through a relatively weak Eastern Conference on their way to the NBA Finals. The thing is, waiting for them in the finals would have been the extremely formidable San Antonio Spurs. Now, it is worth mentioning that the Spurs and Michael Jordan's Bulls faced off twice in the 1998 regular season, and although both games were very close, Chicago won both matchups. San Antonio was even better in 1999 though, as they had lost only one game throughout the Western Conference playoffs on their way to the finals. Along with that, San Antonio was extremely strong where the Bulls were weak, in the painted area. The Twin Tower combination of Tim Duncan and David Robinson would have had the size to give the Bulls nightmares. And if it wasn't the 6'7" Rodman trying to slow them down, it would have been some big like Bill Wennington, who would be on his knees praying for mercy. San Antonio was also the #1 ranked defense throughout the 1999 season, and by no small margin either, as they were consistently allowing the fewest points in the paint. I understand Jordan never lost in the NBA Finals before, but this would have been his greatest test yet, as Rodman was on reduced minutes and an already tired Bulls team had just got through the most grueling schedule they've ever experienced. When you consider how Pippen lost a step, Rodman lost a step, and the favorable matchups in the paint for San Antonio, I see the Spurs winning this series in 6 or 7 games. Now again, it's Michael Jordan in the finals, so maybe he ultimately finds a way to get it done. I think it's unlikely, but who knows? Maybe someone would have personally offended him before the series, in which case all bets would be off. We all know about Michael Jordan's greatest playoff performances, the iconic moments and images where he stood out and excelled at the game's highest level when the games mattered the most. This is how he established his dominance. Despite Michael Jordan being seen as arguably the most clutch player to ever live, there were several times where he was anything but. Some of these instances, many Jordan stans would prefer to pretend never existed, but alas, we're diving into them for a more honest and genuine understanding of basketball history. Number 5. Game 6 of the 1992 Eastern Conference Semifinals against the New York Knicks. With an opportunity to close out the series, Jordan produced one of the worst postseason performances of his career. In a hostile Madison Square Garden, New York completely controlled the game from a physicality standpoint and had Jordan somewhat homesick. The Bulls were actually up by 2 points heading into the fourth quarter, but Jordan went ice cold in the fourth, resulting in the Knicks winning the game by 14 points. On the night, Jordan struggled his way to a total of just 21 points, 8 rebounds, and 7 turnovers on 9 of 25 shooting from the field. He was also 1 of 5 from 3-point range and only 2 of 4 from the free throw line. Number 4. Game 4 of the 1996 NBA Finals against the Seattle Supersonics. This wasn't just one of the worst playoff games of Jordan's career, but it was one of the most inefficient series of his career, as the Seattle defense did a fantastic job of making Jordan uncomfortable and forcing him to take extremely difficult shots. In this game in particularly, it was Gary Payton's Hall of Fame defense that caused Jordan problems. The Bulls had the opportunity to sweep the series, but were instead blown out in Seattle Stadium as Jordan put up a disappointing stat line of 23 points, 3 rebounds, 2 assists, and 4 turnovers on 6 of 19 shooting from the field. Ultimately, Jordan would go on to secure his 4th championship ring, but a sweep of the 64-18 Supersonics would have made it really difficult to argue against the 96 Bulls being the greatest team of all time. Number 3. Game 2 of the 1989 Eastern Conference Semifinals against the New York Knicks. Usually, Jordan was the one dominating New York, but not on this night, as MJ had the lowest scoring playoff game of his entire career. Jordan wasn't just inefficient from the field, but from the free throw line as well, as he finished with only 15 points, 8 rebounds, and 3 assists. To sum up just how disappointing of an evening this was for MJ, consider how John Paxson was the team's leading scorer, who took less than half as many shots as Jordan did. Before their home crowd, New York crushed Chicago with a final score of 114-97. Number 2. Game 4 of the Eastern Conference Finals against the Miami Heat. On this night, Jordan put up a stat line that didn't look all that bad, at least until you looked at his efficiency. With an opportunity to sweep the Heat in Miami, Jordan absolutely folded as he put up 29 points, 8 rebounds, and 2 turnovers on a disgusting 9 of 35 shooting from the field and a terrible 0 of 8 from three-point range. And due to this, the Heat won the game 87-80. Since the NBA merger in 1976, of playoff games where a player attempted at least 35 shots, this was the most inefficient shooting display in NBA history. To say that Jordan was bad in this game would be an understatement. This was literally the most inaccurate brickfest that we've ever seen in the modern playoffs. Fortunately, the Bulls were able to eliminate the Heat in the next game, despite another night of inefficient shooting from MJ. If the Bulls hadn't won the series, this performance would have been haunting MJ's legacy to this very day. Number 1. Game 1 of the Eastern Conference Semifinals against the Orlando Magic. The greatest choke of Michael Jordan's career came on a season where the Bulls failed to win the championship. Whether or not you agree with the narrative that Jordan was still rusty from his baseball playing career, you can't argue with the fact that he was simply not up to his standards on this night, as Jordan finished with only 19 points on 8 of 22 shooting from the field. He also had a disastrous total of 8 turnovers, with the last 2 turnovers coming in the final 20 seconds of the fourth quarter, each of them in a one-possession game. These 2 blunders in the game's most crucial moments were the most unclutched things we had ever seen from him. Jordan said after the game that he felt personally responsible for his team losing, and even Orlando's Nick Anderson said number 45 is not number 23. I couldn't have done that to number 23.
This isn't a video I was originally planning on doing, but it's been a highly requested one, and it can be a fun look at what could have been if Michael Jordan wasn't around dominating the 90s. In theory, Jordan could have played in any era and would have diminished the legacies of his competitors in it. So if anything, hopefully this video will help us appreciate some of the overlooked legends of Jordan's playing days. Now there's a couple different ways to look at a scenario like this. Option 1, you could hypothetically remove Jordan from existence and then speculate the entire ripple and butterfly effect of this move. This literally would change almost everything in the NBA's history since Jordan was drafted. Because if Jordan isn't on the Bulls, then Chicago doesn't win the same amount of games each season, which means draft positions completely change, which means team needs change, which then mean completely different trades and free agency signings are made league-wide. It would totally flip the league upside down. Now there's several NBA YouTubers who have made videos with this specific style, and they're pretty entertaining to a lot of people, but I'm not gonna lie, I really don't like this format too much, because in my opinion, it's way too speculative and completely impossible to accurately guess each ripple effect of the initial change. Now option 2, which is the option I'm going with, is to take the events of the NBA's already written history and simply remove Jordan from that specific timeline, and see how it would have affected the league in a very direct way. So in this video, we'll take a look at 3 aspects, which are the scoring titles, the MVPs, and the championships. Among those, the championships are the only aspect that involves some guesswork, while the others require us to simply look at the runner-up to Jordan in each of those seasons and give him the award as a result. Let's start with the scoring titles. Michael Jordan has by far the most scoring crowns in NBA history with a total of 10. The first 2 seasons, which are 1987 and 1988, now go to one of Jordan's rivals from the Eastern Conference, Dominique Wilkins. He averaged 29 points per game in 87 and 30.7 points in 1988. The human highlight film is now known primarily for his all-time great dunking ability, but back in his prime, he was so much more than just that. Yes, he was an overall incredible athlete, but he was also graceful, had terrific footwork, and was a lethal scorer from the mid-range. It's as Dominique has said about himself before, you don't get over 26,000 points in your career by simply dunking the basketball. The next 4 straight seasons all go to the same player. 1990, 91, 92, and 93 all go to the mailman, Karl Malone, where he averaged 31, 29, 28, and 27 points per game. Karl was obviously a powerful finisher around the rim, but he also had an incredibly smooth jump shot. A lethal combination that translated into him being one of the most dominant scorers of NBA history. The 90s weren't known for their high scoring numbers, and in the entirety of the 90s decade, Malone was the only player other than Jordan to eclipse 30 points per game for a season. He was offensively lethal at a time where that wasn't very common, and Jordan himself was a major reason why Malone's offensive dominance is rarely noticed or mentioned these days. 1993 brings back a familiar face, as Dominique Wilkins once again takes the scoring crown at 29.9 points per game. This would have been his 4th scoring title of his career. At this point, he was 33 years old and was returning from a torn Achilles, which in combination with his age, strongly decreased his athletic ability. With that being said, he was able to expand upon his game and became a lethal 3-point shooter, shooting 38% from that distance while being 7th in the league in attempts per game. In 1996, the scoring crown now goes to Hakeem Olajuwon at 26.9 points per game. Many remember the Dream, as they should, as one of the greatest defensive players of all time, but many forget just how good he was offensively, as he was capable of leading the league in scoring with his impeccable footwork and his soft touch around the mid-range. In 1997, Karl Malone would have once again won the scoring title at 27.4 points, which takes him from 0 with Jordan to a total of 5 scoring titles without MJ, which would have put him only behind Wilt Chamberlain for the most scoring titles in NBA history. In 1998, Shaquille O'Neal takes the scoring title at 28.3 points. As a 25-year-old, this was around the beginning of Shaq's prime, as he bullied and dominated just about every opponent in the paint. Here's a quick recap of where the scoring titles go now with Jordan out of the picture. Feel free to pause the video for a longer look. Next up, we'll take a look at Jordan's 5 MVPs going elsewhere. The 1988 MVP now goes to the Celtics' Larry Bird, who would have won the MVP in about 95% of other seasons with this kind of performance. He led Boston to a 57-25 record as he put up 29.9 points, 9.3 rebounds, 6.1 assists, and 1.6 steals on 52.7% shooting. He also had a 50-40-90 season, making this the second highest scoring 50-40-90 season of all time. This also would have been his 4th MVP in just a 5-year stretch. The 1991 MVP now goes to Magic Johnson, which was his final full season in the NBA. He led Los Angeles to a 58-24 record while putting up 19.4 points, 12.5 assists, 7 rebounds, and 1.3 steals on 47.7% shooting. This was only the beginning of his impressive 1991 campaign, which was overshadowed by Jordan. We'll get into the rest of his incredible season in a bit. The 1992 MVP now goes to Clyde the Glide Drexler, who led his Blazers to a 57-25 record. Drexler put up a well-rounded 25 points, 6.6 rebounds, 6.7 assists, and 1.8 steals on 47% shooting. It's easy to see why Drexler's legacy gets somewhat overlooked when at best he was simply seen as a discount version of Michael Jordan. Without MJ in the picture, Clyde's legacy becomes one of the biggest beneficiaries of the GOAT's absence. The 1996 MVP now goes to David Robinson, who led the Spurs to a 59-23 record. The 30-year-old was dominant throughout the regular season on both sides of the court. He played in all 82 games and put up 25 points, 12.2 rebounds, 3 assists, and 3.3 blocks on 51.6% shooting. The 1998 MVP now goes to Karl Malone, which in hindsight would give him a total of 3 league MVP awards. Karl led Utah to a 62-20 record, which was tied for the best record in the league. He did it with numbers of 27 points, 10.3 rebounds, 3.9 assists, and 1.2 steals on 53% shooting. Now for likely the most interesting part of the video, which is the championships. This is the only part of the video that involves some analyzed guessing, so let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with these choices. In the 1991 NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls defeated the Los Angeles Lakers in 5 games. But to get there, they had to beat the Detroit Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals, which means this hypothetical finals matchup would have been between likely Isaiah Thomas's Pistons and Magic Johnson's Lakers. In my opinion, this would have been a fantastic series, and there's a strong likelihood that it would have gone 7 games. There's this narrative about the 1991 Detroit Pistons that the team was old at this point, and that's why the younger Chicago Bulls swept them out of the East Finals. But that's simply not true. Maybe they were tired and worn down from their 5th straight season with a deep postseason run, but they certainly were not old. At the start of that season, Joe Dumars was 27, Isaiah Thomas was 29, Dennis Rodman was 29, and Bill Laimbeer was 33. Not only were their best players not old, but most of them were at a basketball player's prime age. The Pistons went 50-32 throughout the regular season compared to the Lakers' 58-24 record, so Los Angeles would have had home court advantage, which is definitely significant. They split the regular season series at 1 game apiece, with the Lakers blowing out the Pistons by 24 points in the first game in LA, and the Pistons winning the second game in Detroit by 6 points in overtime. Magic was still performing at an MVP level, and had made an already talented Lakers team look even better with his incredible play. It's worth considering that James Worthy and Byron Scott missed some time in the NBA Finals due to injuries, so those injuries may or may not have occurred against the Pistons, but regardless, Los Angeles was simply playing better team basketball throughout the season. The Lakers won the 1991 championship without Jordan around. In the 1992 NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls defeated the Portland Trail Blazers in 6 games, but the Bulls defeated the Cleveland Cavaliers in the 92 East Finals, which means the 92 Finals would have been between the Blazers and the Cavaliers. The Cavs of the early 90s are one of the forgotten great teams of that era, as they were led by great players like Brad Daugherty, Larry Nance, and Mark Price. Portland, on the other hand, had one of the deepest teams the Bulls had ever defeated, as they had numerous offensive contributors as well as experienced veterans with all defense team selections. Both teams finished the regular season with a 57-25 record, but the Blazers won both regular season matchups with the Cavs, which means they would be the ones with home court advantage, which was an advantage that meant more in the 90s than it has in recent years. Combine that advantage with their overall depth and postseason experience, and I think the Blazers win the championship in 6 or 7 games. In the 1993 NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls defeated the Phoenix Suns in 6 games, but the Bulls defeated the New York Knicks in the East Finals in 6 as well. So in this scenario, the NBA Finals are between Patrick Ewing's Knicks and Charles Barkley's Phoenix Suns. The two teams split the regular season series at 1 game apiece, with the Knicks winning a close one at home while the Suns blew them out in Phoenix. The Knicks won 60 games throughout the season and the Suns won 62, meaning Phoenix would have had home court advantage, where they had been extremely dominant throughout the season. Both teams had very deep rosters, but one of the big deciding factors in my mind would have been the superstars up top. People forget that even in a losing effort, Charles Barkley was an absolute monster in the 93 Finals, but he was simply outshined by Michael Jordan. Patrick Ewing, on the other hand, has had some great postseason performances, but he was also famous for folding in many instances where the games mattered most. Put him in a hostile Phoenix environment with a championship on the line, and unfortunately, I'll have a lot more trust in Barkley than I do in Ewing. I think Phoenix wins the championship in 6 games. In the 1996 NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls defeated the Seattle Supersonics in 6 games, but the Bulls also swept the Orlando Magic in the East Finals, which means the matchup would have been Shaq and Penny's Magic versus Peyton and Kemp's Sonics. This is an extremely fun, hypothetical matchup between two of the greatest teams to fail to win a championship. The Sonics won 64 regular season games, and the Magic won 60. They also split the regular season series with each team winning at home. Now, although the Bulls likely dominate the Magic even if Orlando had been at full strength, it's still worth mentioning that people have forgotten Horace Grant's graphic injury in Game 1 that took him out of the series, so the sweep was a bit easier for the Bulls as a result. Assuming the Magic are at full strength, a matchup with the Sonics would have been an absolute classic series. Shaq is likely having a monster series, as he's taking advantage of the lack of a solid big to defend him, as neither Shawn Kemp or Detlef Schrempf had the size to handle Orlando's center down low. With that being said, other than Chicago, Seattle had the best defense in the league, and a suffocating Gary Payton likely would have been causing all kinds of frustrations for a young Penny Hardaway. Seattle also had a top 10 offense that could play an up-tempo style that would have been difficult for Orlando to handle, especially in the 4 games in Seattle. Ultimately, it would have been an epic series, but I'm going with the Sonics winning the championship in 7 games. In the 1997 NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls defeated the Utah Jazz in 6 games, but the Bulls also beat the Miami Heat in the East Finals, meaning that the NBA Finals would have been between the Miami Heat and the Utah Jazz. Miami is another one of those great 90s teams that are rarely talked about, as they had a solid core of Tim Hardaway, Jamal Mashburn, and Alonzo Mourning, led by the Hall of Fame head coach, Pat Riley. Miami won 61 games throughout the regular season, and the Jazz won 64, and Utah won both matchups in the regular season. It would have been exciting to see two of the strongest players in the league in Alonzo Mourning and Karl Malone meet up in the paint. Especially in the late 90s, Utah was one of the hardest places to win basketball games, so home court advantage once again would have played a huge part. Combine that with Malone having an MVP season and John Stockton being as reliable as ever, and Miami would have probably been dealing with more than they could handle. I think Utah comfortably wins the championship in 5 or 6 games. In the 1998 NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls once again defeated the Utah Jazz in 6 games, but the Bulls also beat the Indiana Pacers in the East Finals in 7 games, which makes this new NBA Finals matchup between Reggie Miller's Pacers and Karl Malone's Jazz. Indiana won 58 games throughout the regular season and the Jazz won 62, and the two teams split the regular season series with both games ending in a small deficit. Although the Jazz would have had home court advantage, Indiana would have been fine with that, as they were extremely poised and were a solid road team throughout the 97-98 season. With Karl Malone and John Stockton, Utah certainly had the bigger superstar names, and they bolstered the league's best offense statistically. But Utah was also in the bottom half of the league defensively, and that would have been an issue considering how deep and how many offensive weapons Indiana had between Reggie Miller, Jalen Rose, Mark Jackson, Rick Smits, and Chris Mullin. They could also try to make Utah uncomfortable with their physical enforcers, like Dale Davis and Antonio Davis, who both were once All-Stars. This is the only time where I'm taking a team without home court advantage, as I simply think Indiana was the deeper team and had the perfect play style and roster to counteract the Jazz's offense. The Pacers won the championship in 6 or 7 games. So now that we've come to conclusions on where the accolades and championships would have gone without Jordan in the picture, what are some noteworthy aspects and legacies that now stand out? Well, for one, Karl Malone would have 3 MVPs, 5 scoring titles, and 1 championship, to go along with the fact that he's in the 2nd spot on the all-time scoring list. With this resume, this probably means that Karl Malone is now rivaling Tim Duncan in the argument of the greatest power forward in NBA history. Dominique Wilkins now gets more recognition for his scoring prowess, as he now has 4 scoring titles to his name. Magic Johnson now has 6 rings and closes out his final full season with an MVP, a championship, and likely a Finals MVP. Due to this, maybe he's even leading the pack in the GOAT conversation now. And lastly, Hall of Famers like Clyde Drexler, Charles Barkley, Gary Payton, Shawn Kemp, Karl Malone, John Stockton, and Reggie Miller now all have championship rings in the prime of their careers, which launches each of their legacies to another level. It's amazing how significantly history changes by simply subtracting one really great player. The year is 1991. Magic Johnson and the Los Angeles Lakers are making their trip to the NBA Finals once again, where they'll be meeting Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls. Magic was coming off of a decade that he essentially owned. He had won 5 championships in the 80s, and he was making an incredible 9th trip to the NBA Finals. Magic was also only 1 year removed from being a back-to-back MVP winner, and he was already the all-time leader in assists. He was a giver who was seen as the definition of a leader who makes his teammates better. If there was one player in the NBA at that time that you would describe as the face of the league, it would probably be Magic Johnson. Now, Michael Jordan was in a much different position. In our modern day of the year 2020, we see MJ as the greatest player of all time, and we know him as a 6-time NBA champion and a perennial winner who did whatever it took to reach the mountaintop. That's our perception of MJ today, but halfway through the 1991 season, the perception of him was quite different. Michael was in his 7th season in the league. He had already won 2 MVP awards, won 5 straight scoring titles, and had set numerous NBA records, but he was still yet to win his first NBA championship. He was still arguably the league's best player, but due to his team's failure to win it all, several common narratives and stigmas began to tie themselves to Jordan. One of the narratives was that great scorers don't win championships, team players do. At that time in NBA history, a leading scorer and a player leading his team to a championship wasn't something that often went hand in hand. In the 60s, Wilt Chamberlain did all the scoring, but Bill Russell won the championships. In the 80s, Jordan was setting scoring records, while facilitators like Magic and Bird were acquiring all the rings. One analyst leading up to the NBA Finals even went as far as saying Jordan was just a great individual player in a team sport. The 2 best players in the league with 2 very different narratives concerning their playoff careers. For all basketball fans who were alive at the time, they'll remember that this was one of the most hyped NBA matchups the league had ever seen.
This is the NBA on NBC. The 1991 NBA Finals. Today, Game 1 between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Chicago Bulls.
Game 1 underway, and it's a close, high-energy physical game throughout. All the stars came to play. Jordan, as usual, is having a great solo performance, putting up a stat line of 36, 12, and 8, while Magic secures a triple-double and one of many of his career. MJ was on fire down the stretch, and seemed as if he was finally ready to seize the moment on the game's biggest stage. Down to the final plays, less than 20 seconds left, and Magic finds an open Sam Perkins for a 3, which puts the Lakers up by 1 point. On the other end of the floor, Jordan tries to do it himself, drives to the basket, and is met by a crowd of Lakers before it's knocked out of bounds. Still Bulls possession. Game on the line, inbounds pass goes to Jordan. He goes for the win, and it's in and out. The Lakers shoot free throws on the other end, and the game is sealed. With the win, the Lakers had stolen home court advantage from the Bulls and seemed poised to win another championship. At this moment, and for the next few days, several narratives seemed affirmed. Magic's unselfish, facilitating style of play was what won the game and set the tone for the series, while Jordan's hero ball translated into losing once again. It was the same formula and result we have been used to, and it didn't appear as if anything was going to change. Game 2 begins, and for a while, it's another close one. Jordan starts the contest looking to be more of a facilitator. By halftime, it's only a 5-point game, and Jordan hasn't asserted himself much offensively. And then, the third quarter begins. MJ became extremely aggressive offensively, and to simply say that he caught fire would be a massive understatement. He couldn't miss anything, and as a result, the game started turning into a blowout. The Chicago crowd was electric. We were witnessing the first time Jordan had ever taken over an NBA Finals. As Jordan continued his onslaught, you could feel the momentum of the series shifting. Only minutes left in the fourth quarter, Bulls are up by 24 points. Jordan has made 12 straight field goals without a miss. And then, this iconic moment takes place.
To Livingston, Jordan. Oh, a spectacular move by Michael Jordan. That's 13 consecutive field goals.
This wasn't just a crazy, unnecessarily difficult layup. It was Jordan's 13th straight made field goal on the NBA's biggest stage, which was the final nail in the coffin against the Lakers, which were led by his only competition as the face of the league, Magic Johnson. It was almost as if Jordan was so hot that he felt as if he had to make his shot even more difficult just to challenge himself. The Lakers would never recover from this point, and the Bulls didn't lose a game again in the series. In this game, Jordan had 33 points, 13 assists, and 7 rebounds on a ridiculous 83% shooting. If I had to pick a moment where Jordan took the torch from Magic, it would be this moment. In this game, Jordan proved that you can win on a championship level as primarily a scorer, that you don't have to be a big man or a pass-first player in order to win championships. This was the series where Jordan went from simply being the best player in the game to the face of basketball. And if there was a moment or a single image that would symbolize that transition, it would be this one. It's June of 1992, and the defending champion Chicago Bulls are coming off of a tough Eastern Conference Finals where they defeated the Cleveland Cavaliers in 6 games. Meanwhile, the Portland Trail Blazers had just defeated the Utah Jazz in 6 games as well, sending themselves to the NBA Finals for the second time in 3 seasons. This all set up a colossal showdown between the 2 best teams throughout the year, who were led by the top 2 players in that season's MVP race, Michael Jordan and Clyde Drexler. They played the same position, they were similar in stature, similar in athletic ability, were almost the same age, and were both the leader of their teams. So naturally, amidst the hype of these NBA Finals, these 2 superstars were being compared to one another constantly among the fans and amongst the media. Maybe the biggest talking point that was consistently being repeated was that Clyde Drexler was just like Michael Jordan, except that Clyde was the better 3-point shooter. Needless to say that this is the kind of narrative that Michael Jordan has been known to take personally. But whether or not MJ liked it, there was certainly some merit to it. Throughout the regular season, Drexler shot 338 3-pointers and made 33.7% of his attempts. Jordan, on the other hand, shot less than a third of that, attempting only 100 3-pointers throughout the season, and he made just 27% of those attempts. Anyone who considered Drexler as the better perimeter shooter were completely justified, but Jordan thought otherwise. On the eve of Game 1 of the NBA Finals, Jordan was being interviewed and was asked about the comparison between him and Drexler in terms of three-point shooting. Jordan went on to say that three-point shooting isn't a part of his game that he focuses on, and said that he would be a much better three-point shooter if he focused on it more. And then, as a direct quote, was the bombshell statement, "Clyde is a better three-point shooter than I choose to be." This was a spicy quote for sure, but as far as we could tell, that seemed to be the end of it, and we assumed both players would bring the skills we've come to expect from them. Well, now it's game day.
This is the NBA on NBC. The 1992 NBA Finals. Tonight, Game 1 between the Portland Trail Blazers and the Chicago Bulls.
The Windy City crowd was absolutely electric, but even they had no idea what they were about to witness. The game begins with Jordan looking to be somewhat of a distributor and play within the flow of the offense. Clyde also appears to be having a strong start of his own, looking to justify the comparisons between the two superstars. But soon after is when we notice something different. Jordan's first shot attempt is a three-pointer. It's off, and the game goes on. Shortly after, Jordan begins to find his stride offensively. But a couple plays later, he once again attempts a three-pointer right in Drexler's face. Given that it wasn't within rhythm and that it was his second attempt in such a short amount of time, it seemed pretty clear that the three-point comparison was something that was still in the back of Jordan's mind. Halfway through the first quarter now, and MJ once again lets it fly.
The field. Jordan again from three-point land. Most unusual to see Michael bombing away. That's his third three-point attempt.
At this point, Jordan begins to catch fire, hitting an array of jumpers, as the Bulls begin to seize the momentum. A couple minutes later, MJ hits his second three off of Scotty's pass, and his third three shortly after that. He closes out the first quarter completely on fire and making the game look easy, finishing with 18 of the Bulls' 33 first quarter points. With momentum in the Bulls' favor, Jordan took an extensive rest and didn't return until it was halfway through the second quarter. But 6 minutes is all Jordan would need to make history. MJ immediately continues his abuse of Drexler, scoring on him in the post. Moments later, Clyde tries to take back some momentum with a three-pointer, but to no avail. Bulls rebound, and Jordan goes on to return the favor by draining a three of his own. It seemed very personal at this point. With that fourth three-pointer from MJ, he tied the NBA record for the most three-pointers ever made in one half of an NBA Finals game. The Blazers called a timeout, but a simple stop in action wasn't going to cool off the best player in the world, and as soon as play continued, he resumed his dominance. He then made his fifth three-pointer, again directly in front of Drexler, securing the record as his own for the most made threes in a finals half. You could see the shock in the faces of the Portland Trail Blazers. This was a guy who made only 27 three-pointers over the course of an 82-game regular season, and now they're witnessing him breaking three-point records on the game's biggest stage. If Jordan hadn't completely made his point yet to Clyde and the rest of the world about the three-point shooting comparison, then this next sequence surely sealed it.
The steal by Pippen. And Jordan. 32 for Jordan. The Bulls by 14. Drexler for three, air ball. Here's Jordan for three, yes! Did you see that look? Michael indicating he can't believe it.
With his sixth three-pointer, he had now tied the NBA record for the most threes in an NBA Finals game, and it only took him one half. With that iconic shot, he also scored his 35th point, which is still an NBA record to this day for the most points ever scored in a half of an NBA Finals game. Pretty incredible stuff when you consider the fact that he didn't even play in 6 minutes of the first half. The Bulls had a commanding lead at the end of the first half, and with the lead reaching nearly 30 points early into the third quarter, Jordan and the Bulls simply cruised from that point on, as he finished the game with 39 points and a 122-89 victory. Marv Albert said Jordan's shrug meant he couldn't believe what he just did. Magic Johnson has his own explanation as to what Jordan meant to say with his famous shrug, and it may or may not be accurate, but for me, given the full context of the comparisons with Clyde Drexler, The chatter about his three-point shooting, the statement by Jordan the day before, and the fact that he just broke the three-point record immediately after Drexler's airball, I always personally interpreted it as Jordan's way of saying, "I tried to tell you." The Last Dance was incredible to watch, but I was kinda disappointed during this bit of the documentary, as I felt like they left out some key details of this incredibly iconic performance. Hopefully this video helped elaborate upon it. This game alone is enough for me to tell people not so fast when they act like Jordan couldn't thrive in this modern three-point shooting era. So what do you guys think? What is the most impressive thing about Michael Jordan? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.